Hi guys, Evan here from GMATlab.com. Today we're talking about the sentence correction section of the GMAT, and we're specifically talking about the words like and as. These two words are very regularly tested on the GMAT, and usually it's in the context of comparisons. It's not so difficult. As soon as you know the rules, you'll get all of them right. Sometimes there's some tricky things that the GMAT does, but once you know the rules, you should be able to negotiate the questions regardless of the tricks that the GMAT tries to throw at you. So there's some things that you need to know in order to get there. Now, what you need to know first of all is about prepositions. Now let's do a little table. So like and as. So like, when it's a preposition, is a comparative word. And what you need to know about prepositions is they must be followed by nouns or things that act like nouns. So like a gerund. Okay, so when like is used as a preposition, it's a comparison. It's a comparative word. So we're talking about comparisons. Okay? So I'll show you plenty of examples of that, but let's just look firstly at as a preposition. Now, as can be a comparison word too, but when it's used as a preposition, it's not actually a comparison word. It's not a comparison. What we're using as when it's a preposition is to say something like as would be in the capacity of. So when we say in the capacity of, we might say I work as a GMAT tutor. And so that's a perfectly legitimate use of as. We're following with the noun, the tutor, and so this works perfectly fine. That's using as a preposition. Then we have conjunctions. Now, like cannot be used as a conjunction, but as can. As, when it's used as a conjunction, is actually a comparison. It's a comparative word. Okay, so here what we can see is when they're comparisons, they're actually two different things, like and as. So conjunctions are usually used to connect clauses, and so a conjunction here, when we use as a comparison, will be followed up usually by a clause. So we can use that to help us. Now that might not be clear yet because I'm using some grammatical terms, but don't worry about the terms too much. What I'm going to show you are some good solid examples so that you'll understand this very easily. So like is the easy one to understand, right? It's the easiest to start with. What we need to know about like is we can't play with it. It has to be followed by a noun. So we could say something like Morocco. It's a country, it's a noun, comma, like. And then what are we going to follow this with? We need to follow it with a noun to compare Morocco to something. Let's say Morocco, like Tunisia, is a country in North Africa. So here we're comparing two countries. So our comparisons need to be logically parallel, right? So these are two things that are logically similar. We're comparing two countries, and we're also using like to compare two nouns. This is the most common kind of simplest comparison that we'll have in the GMAT. Morocco, like Tunisia, is a country in North Africa. And so this is perfectly legitimate. And if we were to use as here, it would be wrong. Morocco as Tunisia, because we're comparing two nouns. Now again, don't worry about that so much yet. We're going to get into as comparisons further. Let's just do another like comparison. So let's say lawyers like consultants must think in a structured way, let's say. Probably better to say manner, but I want to hold the space to give you some more examples. So here again, exactly the same as above. Lawyers like consultants, so we've got noun, like noun. And so don't worry about the fact that we've got verbs coming after and all of that. The most important thing is that we've got noun, comma, like noun. So what the GMAT might do to try confuse us here, to make this a little bit more complex, is they might put in an intervening clause, usually some kind of adjective clause. So we might get something like this. We might insert something, say, here after Morocco. We might get Morocco, which is the world's, let's say, largest exporter of sardines. There's your fact for the day. That's actually true. So we get Morocco, which is the world's largest exporter of sardines, like Tunisia is a country in North Africa. This is still perfectly legitimate. We're still respecting the rules. We're not comparing Morocco to something within this adjective clause here, which is the world's largest exporter of sardines. We're still comparing Morocco to Tunisia. We're using like to compare two nouns. Perfectly legitimate. Okay, so that's another way that you might see it. You'll often get some kind of clause in between. Don't worry about it. It's still exactly the same rules. Everything that you've learned, that you're learning here, still applies. Now let's talk about an as example. Let's say as did Plato, Aristotle believed that there were 3 layers to the soul. Okay, so here we're comparing what Aristotle believed to what Plato believed. So as did Plato, Aristotle believed. And so these are two things they did. We're using as, it's followed by a verb. This is a perfectly good use of as. This is when we want to use as. Now, in the article on gmatlab.com, you'll see other examples of using as, of the use of as. So it's rare enough, but it has happened on official GMAT questions that you'll see as followed by a preposition. So we might get something, let's go just up here, we'll make a little bit of space. We'll say as in Tunisia, in Morocco, something, something, something. That's when we need to use as there too, because we're talking about in. Okay, so make sure that here we're not comparing nouns. So make sure you got the correct use of as here. We couldn't use like here. We couldn't say like in Tunisia, in Morocco, because we wouldn't be comparing nouns. So be careful, watch out for that. That's one of the little tricks that the GMAT might do to make like and as questions more difficult. So that should be kind of hopefully enough information to give you an idea of what's required here. Let's actually take a look at a real question. So let's just move over here. Okay, so we've got this question. There might be things going on here that we haven't fully spoken about, but everything will be very much clear after. Try it out. I suggest you pause the video now. I'll give you a few seconds and we'll talk about it after. Okay, so if you pause the video, welcome back. As with many other modernist writers, T.S. Eliot's poetry had expressed the fragile psychological state of humanity in the 20th century. Okay, so we're saying as with many other modernist writers, T.S. Eliot's poetry. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. We're talking about a noun, and we're talking about a prepositional phrase. This is a preposition. So that comparison is not going to work in terms of the grammar. You also need to know with comparisons in the GMAT, they need to be logically parallel. We need to compare things that are logically the same. these things aren't logically the same. We're talking about with many other modernist writers, and then we're comparing that to poetry. That doesn't really make any sense either. So for those two reasons, A is going to be out. Now, I'll talk about the tense issues that we see here after. We're going to concentrate for now on just the like and as use. In B, we've got as many other modernist writers did. Okay, so this is perfect. This is perfect up to here. So this is, we've got as many other modernist writers did. This is exactly how we should use as. But we have a problem in B that doesn't really work. T.S. Eliot's poetry is expressing. Now, if we had T.S. Eliot's poetry expressed, that would be some way going in the right direction. But we're talking about what writers did. So actually, logically, we should be talking about T.S. Eliot doing something. So what we would have to do to have this as a correct example would be T.S. Eliot expressed in his poetry. That would be comparing what other modernist writers did to what T.S. Eliot did. That would be correct. However, this is not logically parallel because we're comparing writers again to poetry. So again, as I said, comparisons need to be logically correct. So that's not correct for that reason. We also have a tense issue here that we'll go into further detail in a moment. So now we've got rid of everything with as. Let's look at like. Now, if I were doing this question in the GMAT for real, I probably wouldn't go about it this way exactly. I'd start with like because it's much easier to decipher. And what I would do is I would go each side going writers, poetry, writers, T.S. Eliot, writers, T.S. Eliot. That's the real way to attack it in the most efficient way possible. But strategy isn't so much our goal here. What we're looking at is the theory. And so don't worry about that too much for now either, but we'll come back to it. So C, like many other modernist writers, T.S. Eliot's poetry. So here we're comparing poetry to writers. So even though we're correctly using like to talk about noun and noun, we're not logically comparing the same things. C is going to be wrong. D, like many other modernist writers. So we've got noun, and here we've got T.S. Eliot, noun. So here, this is a possessive. So possessive T.S. Eliot's, it's telling us about whose poetry it is. That's an adjective. Something that gives us more information about something else is an adjective. Possessives are always an adjective. And so here in the ones above, the reason they're wrong is because the actual noun that we're talking about is poetry. Here we stop using T.S. Eliot as a possessive. We're not saying T.S. Eliot's. Here we're talking about T.S. Eliot himself. We're talking about the noun. And so here writers and T.S. Eliot are being compared. And so we're comparing two nouns using like. D looks good, looks like it's going to be the answer. In E, we've got writers and T.S. Eliot again. However, there's something going on with tenses. So E is going to be wrong. Now let's move on to talking about tenses. What exactly is wrong with E? Well, T.S. Eliot is whenever he wrote his poetry, it was written back then, and it was what we're saying about what it expressed is true now, today, still, and it was true back then, and it's been true in the intervening period as well. So what we can call this is kind of a general rule. This is something that's true regardless of the time period. So it was true in the past, true in the present, it will be true in the future. So that's what we can call a general rule. General rules should be expressed in the present tense. And so this is the present tense expresses is the present tense. That's why D is correct. Is expressing is the present progressive. Present progressive. So present progressive means right now. So right now, present progressive, I am recording a GMAT tutorial. So that's how we use the present progressive to express something that's happening right now. That is not true for this message of what T.S. Eliot expressed, because it's something that was true in the past, is true in the present, and will be true in the future. It's a general rule, so that's why E is wrong. We saw that there was a tense problem in A as well. Had expressed, that's the past perfect. So that means when we use the past perfect, oops, let's not put it there. When we use the past perfect, and again, this isn't so much for this video, it's not the main goal, but I want to give you a full explanation. We use the past perfect to express something that happened in the past before something else that happened in the past. And we'll use the past perfect before the past simple. And so that's another reason why A is wrong. Another reason why B is wrong, because that's that present progressive. So that's the tense issue as well. So let's go back and talk about the like and as. So we saw in A, as with many other modernist writers, not so much a problem of this first part. There's not so much a problem of the use of as. However, then we're comparing it to a noun, so that it becomes wrong after the comma. So that's why A was wrong. Again, in B, up until the comma, we're using as perfectly, because we're saying we're putting it with a verb. There's a clause here, as many other modernist writers did. Absolutely perfect. But then we've got poetry. We're talking about T.S. Eliot, so we've got this adjective, this possessive that acts like an adjective, telling us about the poetry. And so here's a noun. The comparison isn't legitimate. We're saying T.S. Eliot's poetry is expressing. We don't want to compare what someone did to the poetry, what poetry is expressing. The tense is wrong. Everything is wrong there. So the second half of B just won't work. In C, we get a good use of like in terms of we're comparing two nouns. We're comparing writers and poetry. The problem is they're not logically parallel, so we're not comparing two things that work together logically. Then in D, we get the perfect comparison. We're comparing T.S. Eliot to other writers. That's what we want to compare. It's logically comparable, it's grammatically comparable, and we're using the right tense for this general rule. It's expressing today, yesterday, and whenever he wrote it, it's been expressing this whole time, so it's a general rule. E, we had this tenses problem again. So what I wanted to do here was show you like and as, and I've given you some good examples to work from. I wanted to then show you a question that's pretty complex, right? This is as tough as it gets with like and as. You'll get much easier ones where you'll if you're starting off or you're not scoring so high at the beginning, you'll get much easier ones where it's just a case of we'll get noun compared to clause or something like that. But this was a little bit more complex. And so we had to think about the logic of the comparison. So the comparisons have to be logical as well as just the mechanics of the comparison, whereas the comparisons have to be parallel, and we have to correctly use like and as. So one more time, if we take a look at B, as many other modernist writers did, T.S. Eliot expressed. That would be perfectly parallel. That's not what we got in B. We had to go with like, and we got like writers, T.S. Eliot, so that was a perfectly legitimate comparison. So there you go, that's our explanation of like and as. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't hesitate to like and subscribe to the channel, where I'll be producing loads and loads more videos like this.